Welcome to our session, Exploring the Impact of American Bestsellers. Let me first describe the rationale behind this talk. I study 19th, 20th, and contemporary American literature, and I define the term literature in a very inclusive way. Sometimes a literature curriculum starts with the assumption that the best books are created for aesthetic reasons only. Such a vision of literature's place in society imagines that authors do their work in an intellectual realm that is quite separate from the concerns of everyday life. However, a close look at American literary history reveals numerous productive intersections between important social issues and literary production. At that intersection, we find a host of books whose core ideas have done more than tell compelling stories. These are books that have literally helped change our world. Some of the authors that I'll reference tonight will probably be quite familiar to you. Others may not be, but they're on my list of change makers because of their broad and sustained influence. How do we judge influence? For one thing, we can trace records of people's responses to particular literary texts just as productively as we can read literature with appreciation for its craft. In other words, I connect literature to social history. I think it's productive for the liberal arts to consider how reading can have a wide and lasting social impact. Studying best-selling books across time helps us understand how literature does what American studies scholars call cultural work. More specifically, many best-selling American books have left substantial marks on Americans' everyday lives by challenging our social values and practices, what we think and do, how we create and manage our institutions, how we interact with each other. In that context, we can see that the American bestseller is far more important than an indicator of how people have spent their money. By linking particular bestsellers to significant social concerns of their own time periods, we can move toward a critical analysis of how cultural productions shape long-term social movements. I'm going to begin with some examples from the mid-19th century, when mass production of books became easier due to enhanced print mechanization, and when national-level circulation of texts could be more fully achieved through expanding transportation systems such as steamships and railroads. The mid-1800s, in other words, was the era when mass-market bestsellers were born. The bulk of my list will focus on 20th century texts, however. In the early 20th century, publishing really became big business, with major houses in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia establishing themselves as national organs of production and circulation. The early 20th century is also the first period from which we have very reliable sales figures. As the century progressed, circulation mechanisms expanded even more, and the US population continued to grow. So readership rose, even after television became the new family heart. So my list will close tonight with the 1990s, because recent bestsellers' long-term impact is yet to be determined. No list of bestsellers that have changed American society would be complete without Uncle Tom's Cabin, the 1852 novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe that Abraham Lincoln supposedly credited with starting the Civil War. Whether or not that Lincoln anecdote is really true, and most scholars think it's not, we do know that Stowe's book, which first appeared as a serial in a periodical, changed many minds about slavery. In the rush of reviews, both positive and negative, from all over the US and around the world, and in many examples of personal journals and correspondence, we can track Americans' energetic engagement with the story of Uncle Tom. So today, even as we acknowledge the many racist stereotypes embedded in her narrative, Stowe was, after all, a woman of her time, we should also affirm the influence that this novel exerted on American opinions about race and slavery. In the years just after the Civil War, as the US economy gradually recovered, more and more Americans reached higher levels of disposable income. What to do with that money? With the US becoming more a player on the world stage, travel to foreign places was one obvious answer, and the already popular Mark Twain, pen name of Sam Clemens, stepped in to offer a whimsical but encouraging promotion of going overseas. Innocents Abroad, originally published in 1869, was Twain's best-selling book during his lifetime. Today, we can point to this text as the catalyst inspiring many 19th century American trips to Europe and the Holy Land. And in addition, making foreign travel a step in the grooming of upper middle class Americans during or after college. So if study abroad is popular today, one of the people we need to thank is Mark Twain. Toward the end of the 19th century, huge increases in immigration, industrialization, and the related growth of urban centers were raising anxieties about the U.S.'s ability to maintain values rooted in its rural heritage. Many people turned to religion for solace and guidance. New religious organizations were formed, and both the U.S.-based and the foreign mission movements expanded. Thus, it's not surprising that one of the best-selling books of the 1890s was In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? Written by Charles Sheldon, a minister whose sermons had often taken the form of brief stories, In His Steps actually depicted a minister as its central character. This protagonist meets a poor urban beggar whose Christ-like qualities inspire him to challenge his well-to-do church members to following Christian principles in their daily lives by asking, in any time of uncertainty, what would Jesus do? In His Steps has never gone out of print. And whatever your religious affiliation, it continues to affirm the idea that individual charitable outreach, grounded in Christian principles, can effectively address major social ills. Speaking of immigration, industrialization, and urbanization as social concerns, another book from around the turn of the century addressed these topics from a very different perspective. Published in 1906, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle used strikingly graphic descriptions to expose serious abuses in the meatpacking industry. This book caused such a stir that it led to the creation of a government agency to protect American citizens from health risks by monitoring food preparation. In a broader sense, whereas In His Steps focuses on individuals' responsibilities within society and promotes personal religious freedom and religion as gods, The Jungle led many readers to demand a more activist stance from the federal government, especially around concerns essential to citizens' well-being. Earlier, I mentioned the growing concern at the turn of the 20th century that America might be losing its small-town values. Two of the most striking literary responses to this issue appeared right around the same time, in 1915 and 1920. Main Street, a 1920 novel by Sinclair Lewis, suggested to many readers that the idealization of small-town America was misplaced, that small-town life was actually a constraining force, better left behind. With a parallel setting and themes, Edgar Lee Masters' collection of poems, Spoon River Anthology, presented a series of often dark monologues by the imagined citizens of a small town. Through their insistent social critique, these two best-selling books can be credited with helping many Americans get over their fear of urbanization. When the Depression hit in the 1930s, people still found ways to buy books, partly because some of those being published explicitly addressed the challenges that the nation was facing. On the nonfiction front, Dale Carnegie's upbeat 1937 How to Win Friends and Influence People won readers galore by asserting that financial success was still possible in America. 2 years later, John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, took a darker tone, while demonstrating that many who had suffered financial ruin had not brought it on themselves, and therefore deserved support. In the world of Steinbeck's novel, characters who abused the downtrodden were clearly cast as un-American. Although Steinbeck didn't claim the Nobel Prize until 1962, The Grapes of Wrath is the text most praised in the official citation. We could create an entire syllabus of best-selling books from the World War II era, and one thing we'd want to highlight is the role that such books played in the war effort. But I want to focus tonight on the years just after the war, when 1940s and 1950s prosperity brought on different kinds of challenges, even amid the glow of victory. One of those challenges, interestingly enough, was what to do with all those women who had heeded the call to aid the war effort by moving into the workforce, while so many American men were fighting overseas. Get married and have babies was one directive, as the demographic bulge of the baby boom attests. In 1946, on the front end of that boom, Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care became a huge bestseller. The impact of Spock's book can be measured in part by the lingering influence of its then radical credo, that raising a child is a nurturing act, which should respond consistently and carefully to the child's needs. While Spock's nonfiction powerhouse aimed primarily at the post-war American woman, another best-selling book soon afterward focused on men. A.C. Kenzie and his research team shocked readers with the 1948 Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which argued that American men's sexual practices were far more variable than had been assumed, and that normal sexual behaviors included a broad spectrum. Though little of Kenzie's work found widespread acceptance initially, it nonetheless opened the door to more examination of and accepting views about sexuality in American culture, as would be seen before too long in Helen Gurley Brown's less scientific and more titillating Sex and the Single Girl. Kenzie's and Brown's books touted liberation. A major bestseller of the 1950s claimed readers by depicting what a middle-class American needed to be liberated from, the contaminated power of corporate culture. In Sloan Wilson's 1956, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, readers found a critique of post-war financial success, when such success could be achieved only by undermining fundamental values. Though we sometimes think of the 1950s as a rather staid era, in books like Sloane's, we can see the seeds of social action being sown through a pointed questioning of post-war social institutions. With that kind of critique having been mounted, the bestsellers in the 1960s and 1970s would explode onto the American scene, touting activist agendas. Of course, not all of these agendas were fulfilled immediately, but hindsight can help us see how a bestseller like Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring laid the groundwork for the environmental movement of today. How Betty Friedan's 1963 The Feminine Mystique established a platform for the women's movement that helped guide its work in succeeding decades. Similarly, the 1964-65 book The Autobiography of Malcolm X, drawn from interviews done by Alex Haley, took a more assertive stance than Dr. Martin Luther King's writings of the same period, thereby differentiating its message from calls for patient civil disobedience, but simultaneously making the nonviolent campaign for civil rights more palatable to white America. Intriguingly, Malcolm's co-author, Alex Haley, would have another bestseller just over a decade later when the Roots book produced a spin-off television miniseries drawing over 130 million viewers. With its appealing multi-generational portrait of African American history told through one family's story, Roots solidified the previous gains of the civil rights movement by successfully persuading whites to embrace Kunta Kinte and his descendants. Alongside the movement-oriented bestsellers from this time, we should also note a pair of books which, a decade apart, examined the American presidency. In 1964, on the heels of the assassination, United Press International produced a major bestseller by recounting a story of America's initial grieving. 4 Days, the historical record of the death of President Kennedy, not only created an archive of a pivotal moment, it also helped position U.S. presidents as monumental figures whose lives require memorializing, even consecration. The palatial presidential libraries built since then are just one sign of this shift in America's thinking about our chief executives. A decade later, on the other hand, in 1974, Woodward and Bernstein published All the President's Men, which set up a perennial flip side status for presidents as needing to be constantly scrutinized, potentially criminal figures whose abuses of executive power citizens have to keep tightly in check. Moving to the 1980s, let's bookend this period with memorable bestsellers from the start and close of the decade. What might we learn by rereading Cosmos by Carl Sagan from the 1980 year, a book that urged Americans to embrace the universe and the likelihood of other life forms beyond our own, and juxtaposing that with the big-time success book of 1990, Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Sagan's book, like Roots, also linked to a highly rated television show, prompted Americans to think outside themselves, to envision other worlds and consider what the scope of the universe might say about our own daily self-centered preoccupations. But by 1990, at the close of the decade that some have called the era of greed, we were apparently far more interested in codifying steps to surefire personal success in this world. Amazon.com tells us that the original Covey book is still a mega blockbuster, with over 15 million copies sold. Maybe we can take some comfort in the content of The 8th Habit, released in 2006, which touts the need for cultivating others' abilities once we have found our own voice. I'd love to march us through the 1990s, the heyday of Oprah's book club, and then into the 21st century, when what becomes a bestseller is often determined by the financial powerhouses of the mega chains like Barnes & Noble, and when new formats for reading are changing the book itself. But we may not have enough critical distance yet to assess the long-term impact of recent bestsellers. And in any case, I'd like to hear from you. What are some recent bestsellers that you think have already had or will have significant social impact? And why? Let's hear what you're thinking about Americans' more recent reading choices and their connections to the issues of today. Send me an email with your thoughts at s.robbins@tcu.edu.